First, I really want to welcome CJ Chivers, who's with us, and I'll give you a little bit of background on CJ or Chris before we get started. So you should know that he's a journalist and an author with a very distinguished career. He's a graduate of Cornell University. Then he served as, let me emphasize, Ranger Qualified Marine Infantry Officer. When he left active duty, he returned home and went to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. He started working at the Providence Journal before being hired by the New York Times in about 1999. And he's worked with the New York Times or New York Times Magazine since 1999. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent. I want to list off just a couple of his garden spots that he spent an incredible amount of time in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's been to Chechnya, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Libya, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. And again, now he's assigned to the New York Times Magazine. So in 2010, he published a book called The Gun, and it's about automatic weapons and kind of a technical aspects about these automatic weapons, but also more so, I'll say, the social impact that these weapon systems have had on the world. And then in 2018, just recently, he published the book, The Fighters, Americans in Combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's what really want to talk about. We'll talk about both books, but really want to get into the fighters here in a little bit. So Chris has been awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for international reporting and one for feature writing. And earlier in his career, he was granted a Pulitzer International Traveling Fellowship, and he was also received the Livingston Award, which is sometimes known as the Pulitzer Prize for the Young. Many, many years ago he won that, but or was awarded that. He's been awarded numerous other writing and editorial awards to accompany those mentioned above. And Chris is married, and he has 5 children. They reside in Long Island. So with that short intro, Chris, really want to welcome you and tell you, I think it's fitting that at the United States Military Academy, we're kicking off what we call Branch Week. And Branch Week is important to all 4,400 cadets we have, but particularly our class that will graduate in 2019. So as we look at the gun, the tools that will be utilized by our graduates, and also probably faced by our graduates in short order, and then we look at the fighters who our graduates will not only lead, but will ultimately become as they proceed in their careers in the military. I think it's, like I said, kind of special that you're here on this day talking to the cadets, and we'll get this out to many more. So with that, I'd like to ask you a few questions for 20 or 30 minutes, 35 maybe, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And really, I'd like to start with the gun and just ask kind of what's the impetus for the gun, and explain the book and really the social impacts that you see. And I know you use terms like battlefield leveler and really the impact of these automatic weapons.
So I wanted to try to understand and then document the way that technology and markets and tactics had been so affected by the mass miniaturization of firepower. So everybody knows that rapid firearms started in the 19th century, but they were big. I mean, you needed to drag them around with a carriage in the beginning, and many soldiers were needed to operate them. And this is very important, in order to pull that off, they were the tools of states, of state armies that were connected to national economies. I wanted to follow the miniaturization of rapid firearms down to something that weighs 6 or 7 pounds and you can hide under your blouse, because that was a battlefield leveler. And with miniaturization came mass production and mass distribution. And if you follow the way weapons changed, rapid firearms changed, you follow the way wars changed. First, most noticeably in World War I, when many infantry tactics were rendered essentially instantly obsolete, although it took a while for tacticians and leaders to catch up to that. But still at that point, weapons were principally in the hands of armies or army-like organizations But with the mass production of the Kalashnikov assault rifle and its connection to the mass planned economy, we created enormous stockpiles of weapons that eventually would break free, and they would end up in the hands of irregular combatants. And when we did that, empire duty, if you want to call that, or Army expeditionary duty, completely changed. Because now there was, as the word you use, battlefield leveler. Now when an American patrol or any conventional patrol goes out into a battlefield that's reasonably mature, and by that has been fought for a while, so it's long enough for the weapons to show up, you face people who can fight you at the rifle level, toe for toe, blow for blow, and that's really changed warfighting. And I wanted to capture that. That was what the book was about.
So when you looked at kind of the initial face-off, I think you couched really as Vietnam, when we had AK-47, the Kalashnikov, Vice, the AR-15, or the M16, and then how that somewhat legitimized the weapon later on, or maybe the 1972 Munich Olympics legitimized the AK-47 as kind of a tool of jihad and outlaws and criminal gangs. Can you talk to that a little bit?
So certainly Vietnam is where, that was the moment where all conventional militaries realized they needed to have assault rifles. There had been a long debate in the Army about other types of rifles and the value of aimed fire and marksmanship, not in the Army, just the Marine Corps, and not just the American services, but more broadly across the world. When the Kalashnikov came out and was distributed initially to Soviet land forces, but eventually to proxy forces in Vietnam, it was very poorly regarded by military traditionalists. It was seen as a submachine gun. Its medium power bullet was seen as insufficient for long-range shooting, and we thought that it could be dismissed. Very quickly in Vietnam, where in the close quarters of thick vegetation fighting, our soldiers and Marines were being outgunned, we changed our perspective, and the AR-15 became the M16 in a jumpstart fashion very, very quickly, in a matter of a few years. The early M16s did not work well because they hadn't been debugged, and they cost a lot of people their lives. But by the end of that war, when we come into the 70s, the mass distribution of the weapon was beginning to happen. So the Soviets and their forces were replacing their first-generation Kalashnikovs with second-generation Kalashnikovs, and the excesses were starting to turn up with proxy forces, and the weapon did become lionized, celebrated by a lot of very bad actors. It became sort of an icon or a symbol of uprising and defiance or even revolution. Much of that, I think, is misapplied. It's just a weapon. It doesn't deserve all those symbols. But as it spread, it changed place after place where it appeared.
And you highlight the low recoil of the weapon also being attractive, really, and controllable by smaller stature people, to include children. And you talked about the different entities, if you will, that will use the weapon or arm and train young children on that. Can you talk to that a little bit?
So if you were to fire the old rifles of, let's say, yesteryear, World War II and before, these rifles had a much more powerful charge, and they were hard to shoot. If you go back to the era, different militaries had different versions of the Enfield, the Mosin Nagant. In our country, we had a long history with the M1 that came later, but before that, we were firing weapons that were much like in cartridge what we use now in our medium machine guns, and they had tremendous recoil. They were intimidating for people to fire. They were pretty slow firing, and logistically, to carry 300 rounds, you would weight down a smaller statured person. The Kalashnikov and then the M16, which followed it, used much smaller, lighter ammunition because it was cycling the weapons through a semi-automatic cycle. It converted some of the recoil energy to cycling the weapon and reloading it, and suddenly the battlefield, our combatants on the battlefield became demographically much different. We could have younger soldiers, even children. We could have women. We could have people who were not fit and trained like conventional soldiers were, who were able to lay down effective firepower and carry a lot of ammunition. for a relatively small recoil or weight penalty. And this is another thing, I think, that made places like where your soldiers had to fight so incredibly dangerous.
And I look out here and I see special forces officers, infantrymen that I know have been in hard combat, armor officers that had parked their tanks and picked up M4s, if you will, to fight people with a version of the Kalashnikov. I see artillerymen that had to do the same thing, see cadets that will have to do that in the future. All these are kind of versions of the fighters. And you went to a second book in 2018 that just came out. Some books by Chris just came out. And, you know, he highlights that 3 million people have served in, nearly 3 million have served in Afghanistan and Iraq right now. And you really chose 6 to follow through. And as I told Chris earlier today, I really, I kind of expected something different than was in the book, and was pleasantly surprised with what I read about really the humanistic aspects of being a fighter, especially in the current war, the global war that many of you have shared multiple tours on. But he picked 6 people, and he starts off with a Navy lieutenant who's a F-14 pilot, Naval Academy grad in '95, Lane McDowell. And not surprising to you that, you know, he's a commander at the end of the book. I think getting close to making 06 or an 06. He picks Army Sergeant First Class Leo Kerchevsky, who's an infantry man, served in the Rangers, ultimately served in Special Forces, wounded. Talk about him. He picked up our selected Navy Corpsman Dustin Kirby, and also talks about Dustin's cousin, Joe Dan Worley, who was also a Navy Corpsman, both serving with Marines on the ground. Army Chief Warrant Officer Mike Slobodnik, OH-58 pilot. Army Specialist Robert Soto from 126 Infantry, who was serving in the Korengal Valley at the time he writes about him. And then Marine Corps Lieutenant Jared Neff, very interesting lieutenant who served in Marja in Afghanistan. But why these 6? Why these 6 people?
So I spent many years, I mean, I was at 9/11, a few blocks away when it began. I was there when the towers came down, and I spent many years going back and forth to Iraq and Afghanistan, and got to know many people, an uncountable number. And to choose 6 was a process of eliminating hundreds. And what I looked for, I didn't write the book for you. The things that are in the book are many things that you either already know if you served, or will figure out because you're part of this professional and social community of officers. But much of our country is completely disengaged from its fighting class. There's like almost no connection to the fighting class. And I wanted to create a book for them that could show something about what the experience since 2001, when I believe with good justification, our country chose military action in Afghanistan, through the present day, what that experience has been for the people who were connected to this fight directly. And to do that, I needed to choose characters who would cover the many different phases and places of the war, and who each delivered a different portion of what I would call like the common idiosyncratic experiences of the war. And those of you who were in the wars, you know what they are. Being ambushed or ambushing, calling for air, or being involved in airstrikes, dealing with civilian casualties, trying to work with partner forces that were, to use the gentlest language, very frustrating as we designed them. I don't blame the Afghans for much of this, or the Iraqis. To deal with casualties, including becoming a casualty yourself, and then to deal with the moral and psychological and physical and familial burdens that come with coming home after war. So think of the 6 characters, Colonel, as like a garage band. Each one's playing a different instrument, but together they maybe give you a song. And I wanted to follow that in such a way that you could see if you weren't familiar with the wars, how the wars changed, how the enemies changed, how our tactics and our equipment and our doctrine and our missions and our force levels and our ambitions on the ground all changed, and to bring you through that from the people who were serving, or to say it more harshly, perhaps in some cases, stuck within the policies that our country created for them.
So of the 6, 3 services covered, but includes a naval aviator. Have KIAs, wounded, and then people that return with kind of, we'll say, moral dilemmas or emotional challenges with the actions that they took. And again, to that aspect, yeah, I think it shows the reader the kind of the human toll, if you will. And I know you're pretty passionate about how this all-volunteer force is utilized by policymakers, we'll say, and perhaps senior leaders. So can you talk about your opinions or your ideas about this all-volunteer force and how it is utilized to achieve policy ends or not?
So we'll do the basic math. About 3 million Americans put on the uniform and turned up in Iraq or Afghanistan as volunteers. It's less than 1% of the country. Now let's extend the math, because nobody goes to war alone. Everybody has a family. So if you talk about immediate family, we may get somewhere near the vicinity of 10% of America over 17 years at some point or another had a real physical stake in these wars. I don't think it's enough. I think we have a system that architecturally has designed popular disengagement from the wars. And the epigraph of the opening quote in the book is taken from something that Marines had written on a door in the Ramadi Government Center in 2007. It was photographed by a friend of mine, and it said, America is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall. I don't think we can really knock America for that, although it's easy and sometimes I do it. I think we have to knock the system that we have, where since the end of the conscription period in our country, we no longer have people who need to pay attention to the wars, because there's basically something like 0 chance that their household will have to participate in them unless one of their children volunteers. It surprises me to say this, and reporters aren't supposed to have policy positions, and in almost all cases I don't. And we're contemporaries, we're almost exactly the same age. We joined the military at almost exactly the same period, with almost exactly the same motivations, and went to many of the same schools and know many people in common over the years. We came, the colonel and I, up, I don't know what you heard, but I was trained in many cases by conscripts who had stayed in, and by veterans of the Vietnam War, who told me again and again when I was a young officer, man, you're lucky to be in now. We don't have those draftees here. And the other thing they'd say, and we also have urinalysis now, so we're not all stoned. And these are different years. This force is easier to lead, and we're better at our jobs than what we were when I was a corporal or a sergeant or a lance corporal in my first enlistment. And I believed that, like the Kool-Aid. I consumed it, and I carried it in me for years, notwithstanding the fact that conscripts won World War II. I bought that. I came over time, though, over the last few years, to come to see it differently, that we have, without a draft, people don't have to pay attention. And if people aren't paying attention, politicians don't have to pay attention. And it allows the body politic to not really supervise or even think much about these wars, besides the reflexive idolatry of our soldiers, the almost worship of our veterans and our soldiers, which much of it, I'm sure you can see through it too, is just performance. So I have come around to thinking that a small draft in which we had a mail lottery, which hooked our citizens up randomly to our foreign policies, might lead to better foreign policies. Because as soon as, and I'll say this crudely in shorthand because we're short on time, but as soon as rich kids were hooked up to these wars, rich kids might be in body bags, I bet we have a lot different conversation about what our national strategy is. and people would pay more attention. And much of what I saw over the last few, well, now let's not say few, many years since 2001 has felt like a strategyless war. Services adrift, and good people who joined in good faith and had great commitment and solid competencies hooked up to tasks that couldn't succeed. And it's a sorrow. And I think we built it that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So with the all-volunteer force, and I mean, I'm one of them, but I've heard this repeated numerous times since 2001. Is President Bush purposefully said he wanted Americans to go to the mall and not to change our lifestyle, not let 9/11 change the fabric. And when family members and others would graciously say thank you for your service, we feel guilty about going to the mall, celebrating July 4th or whatever, and you're deployed. And in my heart and in my conversations, I would sincerely say that's where you need to be. That's why I'm over here. I'm fighting the away game so our society doesn't change and our fabric doesn't change. And I've said that, I think, for almost 2 decades now. So I'm certain, and should have mentioned, I know you don't know the exact count, but some people have accredited you with being overseas 5, 7 years. So you've paid a burden, and your family has paid a burden to cover these stories. But when you run into, and I'm sure you've run into volunteers that say something to that effect, or if you have, how do you respond to that, or how do you couch that?
Well, let me say that, I just talked about my coming around to having a different view of the all-volunteer force and conscription. I should declare that there is about as much chance of that changing as you guys being assigned to an outpost on the moon. I mean, it's not going to happen. So in some ways, this is a thought exercise, and I say it, I think, more to shame the system than to expect that the system will change. I mean, I'm a realist. I mean, war makes you a realist, and I'm very much a pessimistic realist. So I don't think my ideas will get any traction whatsoever. I intend them more as to stimulate thought about our national disengagement. Look, I'm socially awkward. I'm shy. I don't like being around crowds or dealing with people. I got a wonderful family. I spend my spare time fishing and clamming and growing onions and petting my dog. I don't interact much with people. Not many people come up and thank me for anything. And when they do, I just mumble through it. I don't have a good answer, I suppose. You have developed a talking point or an answer like the Terminator screen, like the option comes down and it slides down. I'm going to say this, and I don't have that. I'm not as quick as my feet as you are. My feeling always was, and I mean, this is, part of the sorrow perhaps of having lived life this way. I joined because I wanted to join. I joined the Marine Corps because I wanted to be a Marine. I had curiosities about a new war that was starting when I was a freshman in college, which was, for me, the event that made me take notice was the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 241 Marines and sailors. That's what pulled me into the Marine Corps. I was a true volunteer. I've been asked recently if you could get a time machine and go back, would you do something different? Because, my whole life has been basically a study of organized violence. And like some guys my age know how to dance or sing or do things. All I know how to do is think about tactics and weapons and violence and death. And it's not great for you, right? It kind of makes you stunted in your head if that's all you're doing. I also know, maybe it's our fate, that if I could go back to 1983, I'd do the same thing. So that doesn't leave me in a position to accept thanks from anybody, because I was probably just wired this way, And if I had been in another country, I probably would have ended up in their infantry too.
I look out in the crowd we have here, and I see our Defense Strategic Studies Director, MWI Director, and West Point allows for a lot of intellectual debate. And a couple articles that we talked about that MWI had posted were the idea that we need optimistic generals, optimistic leaders to get us through some of the darkest times. Immediately the next day was an article posted actually by people that work in this department that was like, whoa, hold on, curb that enthusiasm a little bit.
That was the headline, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The second one? Yeah.
And then we talked about maybe the middle ground's an article coming out on realism, as you had mentioned earlier. But we kind of talked the policy level, but then you had made a comment early in this discussion about a lack of strategy as we go forward into Afghanistan, into Iraq, back to Afghanistan, back to Iraq. Can you talk about your take on strategy and where our senior leaders are?
Sure. So allow me a declaration of bias, because you need to hear it, and then you can apply that to what I'm going to say. I told you I'm a pessimist, and I'm a very strong public critic of our senior military leadership. And part of that is I am unable, after a reasonably intensive lifelong study, to articulate what our strategy is in terms of fighting the global war on terror. And it's many, many different components and pieces, from CT to COIN to the straight occupation period to regime change to national development to women's rights to counter-narcotics, to all the different pieces that formed this effort to make sure we did not have another 9/11 minimally and perhaps in our idealistic fashion to improve the world maximally. I don't buy it because I don't understand it. I can't hear a strategy. Part of that is the body politics fault. I don't feel Congress pushes the military leaders to articulate it. I don't think we've had a president, and I'm not a member of a party, I should say, so don't take this as a criticism of any one of the three presidents who've presided over this period. It's aimed at all three, regardless of their party or their length of service. I don't feel we have a national leadership who has hooked us up to realistic goals that we can articulate as a nation that we're pursuing. I don't, and I blame a lot of people for it. Part of it is the demographic of the all-volunteer force. You guys have something like zero political clout, even though you get free tickets to Fenway, and you might think you do. You don't. Part of it is the nature of politicians all protecting their right flank, so nobody wants to hit the off button on any of these wars, because then you'll get blamed for the attack that follows. Part of it is that my generation of officers had no power, really, and we failed to bring about what I think we would have liked to have brought about. I mean, I can't speak for you, but I can describe the puzzle that I think you had to live at one point in your life in the Korengal, where you're an able-bodied, able-minded, thoroughly trained, super enthusiastic battalion commander who grew up in a period where you were taught maneuver warfare, among other things, and commander's intent and the flexibility to influence the enemy and the battlefield as you saw fit, and you showed up with a highly trained paratrooper unit, one of the best infantry units probably that's ever existed. I say that as a Marine. Complementing certain elements of the Army, which are magnificent in their raw infantry abilities. And you were given a list of outposts that you had to staff, and it took almost all of your units to do that, and you had to stay there for a certain amount of months, and how do you really influence that? Someone else had designed your war for you before you inherited it, and you weren't alone. My contemporaries in the Marine Corps were battalion commanders, and then brigade commanders, and then G3s as the wars went on. And they were the operators who were actually the gears that actually turned whatever the strategy was into the way it played out on the ground with the level of at which you cadets will soon be performing your own service. And they were the same. You know, it was a sorrow in a way when you don't really have a strategy and when you have a military that was under-resourced for what it was asked to do. Because I would argue you could put, as we did, 100,000 American service members in Massachusetts during a war, then you wouldn't win. You wouldn't be able to control Massachusetts. We put 100,000 plus about 50,000 allies in a nation of what, 28 million? Don't hold me to the number, but near 30 million in Afghanistan, who couldn't speak the language, who didn't know the culture, who in many cases were hard-helmeted kids trained essentially in infantry tactics and fire support and the immediate battle drills, the multiple types of 9 lines you need to survive on the modern battlefield. And we put them on a nation of 28 million on a short fuse mission of a few years. There was just no way that was going to work. Who do you blame for that? Do I blame a colonel? Would I blame you? Of course not. Blame the architects of this. I mean, what were they thinking, right? I mean, who really thought that we could, in Afghanistan, remake the country with a large conventional footprint, not a large, 100,000 conventional footprint for a few years? Why did we do this? Who do we hold accountable? I think this is a discussion we should be having for the rest of our lives, so people like you who showed up here in good faith are used in a better fashion and in line with realistic goals. Sorry for my downer. I warned you. I have a bias, so go back to the start.
So back to your sister service, or your parent service, I should say, our sister service. The Marines had the good fortune, if you will, of largely starting with a blank slate in Helmand.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about 2% of the population had 20% of the force in the country, or 20% of the American force, 20,000 in Helmand province, could largely, I won't say write their strategy, but could largely influence their tactics of how they wanted to operate in that area. And we had kind of similar results as I'd say I did in Kunar, inheriting somebody else's strategy. And can you talk through the Marines going into Bastion or Leatherneck, their operational, their intent? And this is Jared Neff's story, I think, going into Marja as an example in the troubles they faced as they went in there, trying to implement what they believed was higher level policy and strategy.
So I'm going to give you a large answer, and then we're going to work our way down to lower level answers, and then we're going to actually have a mechanical one that relates to your own battlefield template that you had in and around the Pesh Valley. So the Marines took their experience of Iraq and tried to apply it to Afghanistan. The Marines are, in some ways, and I say this perhaps with affection, perhaps with cynicism, kind of a big legal gang. And they're almost off the books sometimes, it seems, from the national strategy. Why? How they were able to talk the DOD into getting 20,000 troops, 20% of the American force, put onto 2% of the Afghan population, which was remote from any rural area or any urban area where the population clustered, is beyond me. And it seems to me that that was principally the Marine Corps playing Marine Corps at the senior level. And now we're going to come down a level. One thing that followed your command of the Korengal, 2 commanders later, was an assessment done of the Nicholson outpost, let's call them, a lot of the remote outposts. And the decision was made after a great deal of debate and the creation of studies and documents to have a more population-centric approach and pull out of these rural canyons that sucked up combat power, sucked up logistics, didn't have much effect except creating a lot of dead insurgents and quite a few dead Americans, and move them down closer to the population. And if we mass the combat power near the population, we might have more effect near the population. And in other words, it was a rebuke of years of fighting out of remote outposts in a remote province. And so the Marines show up contemporaneously with this, and they do exactly the thing the Army had just decided we shouldn't have done in the first place, and create a constellation of outposts on areas along the river basin of the Helmand River, and then put one line unit after another in these outposts to hold. Marines run 7-month tours typically, not 12 or 15-month tours. and they run at a faster tempo than the Army. They wear themselves out quickly. You've never seen anything. You've seen how Marine platoon patrol at the squad level, patrols going all day, round the clock, to the point where they're veiny, thick bicep zombies stumbling around out there with rifles in groups of 10. The Marines went and basically pursued in Afghanistan what the Army had tried. It was almost as if the two services weren't talking. The Army had tried and decided wasn't a good idea. And it's not hard for American conventional forces to push into someone else's turf, claim a ground, throw up HESCO barriers, run a flag up, name it for the unfortunate few who died in the initial phase, and start patrolling. Well, does it make sense? Having a bunch of little outposts that you create what we call a security bubble has two meanings, because that's never clear to me. Are we securing the Afghans or are we securing ourselves? But you run a security bubble around it of endless patrols. You keep your line of logistics open, usually a road, sometimes it's air only. And what effect are you really having on the Afghans in a way that's going to work out to your benefit over time? I think that ultimately the Marine decisions and how they arrayed themselves on the battlefield were, as I started with, not connected to probably the needs of the force. It would have been wiser to put them maybe near the Arghandab or over by Kandahar, a more populated area, more closely connected to the main efforts of the war. And then the conceptual mistake of how we deployed the force was then followed up by this template that they followed that had already been proven not to work in RC East. And we ran this as a country essentially till the clock ran down, right? That's why we stopped. There was a timeline on it. The clock ran down, so we wound down, and we pulled out. And at the same time, Army units were arrayed along RC East, had pushed in and made some similar mistakes out along the Pakistani border. And I remember talking to commanders in both services at the time who would say, even as they were building new outposts, we know that the Afghans won't be able to handle this when we go, and we can look on the calendar and we know we're going to go. Why did we do all that? Why did we do all that? I don't know the answer because I don't have enough time to investigate and interrogate every one of the decision makers, but history will determine these answers collectively. People like me will work on it, and I think history is going to be very, very unkind.
Thank you. I think we'll open it up to questions and answers with that, or their questions, your answers.
Sure.
And keep building on that. Otherwise, I'll keep talking here. So, Nate, I'm looking up at you. I'm looking for a zinger right here.
I'm going to put on my glasses now so I can actually see, because I'm only seeing about 30 feet out. Now I'm going to see your faces.
Dave Danford.
Sir, my name is Peter Danford. I was one of the officers that served in 2000 with Brian. You guys left with. You mentioned that as we've gone along, it seems like there's lost sight of why we're doing what we're doing. And I've observed in my career that officers seem to be increasingly more comfortable with basically never ending war. I've seen actually colonels come around and Pentagon and brief a misunderstanding of our Army policy. Do you see the same thing and think it's a problem for why we want to bring essentially conflicts to a half conclusion? Or that's not really our lane, which is often the counterpoint to that testing validity that we aren't really supposed to direct that policy.
So, of course, soldiers want war, or some soldiers want war. It's in the nature to, if you're training for something, to be curious about what it is. I don't mean want, like ache for and really want it. Many soldiers, anyhow, who get there immediately don't want it once they see what it is. But it's natural to be curious about it. It is the society's job to only let you go to war for reasons that are clearly in the national interest and in line with achievable ends. So I know all sorts of people who, like you described, want war or regret that they missed the last deployment to Afghanistan. Who feel like they're a boot in the Marine Corps or a cherry in the Army because they're surrounded by people with all this experience that they fear that they'll never get to know. I understand that. I'm not going to put a value judgment to it. I mean, there'll be people who argue, well, that's fucking stupid. And there'll be people who will argue, well, that's maybe the type of people we need to win the fights we get in. And there's everything in between. I'm not going to take a position about it, except to say that as a society, it is our job to use you wisely. And one of the problems with, as we were discussing in your various articles, the optimistic generals, is the way the national instruments work to determine the strategies that we have right now, whatever you want to call it, optimism, enthusiasm, or skepticism and cynicism on the other end, we do not have an honest checks and balances on the generals who do better if they're yes people than if they're naysayers. The system promotes success and enthusiasm. Eeyore is not going to wear a star in the Army, right? But the guy who says I can, or the woman who says I can get this done and says that loudly and demonstrates it across a career is going to continue to move up. So how does it work? We have a strategy, small s, air quotes around strategy. And then we have generals who work with, a DOD who works with the executive, determine the force levels for the strategy. Then we promote a general to lead the strategy, even though he's or she is inevitably going to be under-resourced. And we send the general abroad to, at the moment, Kabul or Bagram. And the general immediately has to speak cheerfully and optimistically. And then we have commanders in the States, his or her commanders, and civilian leaders who say we're deferring to the commanders in the field, and so they echo the commanders' talking points. And so we've got this endless loop of polishing the analysis that is also what the Congress hears by reading the newspapers or watching the news, and the president hears by reading the newspapers and watching the news. And so we've created this system of cheerfulness on top of what's often, let's say, incoherent at best and a shit show at worst. And there's no check and balance on that. Because if the general gets over there and immediately says, this isn't working and I'm understaffed and I don't see how this is really in the national interest, the general's on a plane home immediately, and they'll find someone else who can say the right things. I don't really think we have checks and balances. Again, these are my biases, and I am a pessimist, so I say this, and you might not agree with it, but I can see how that early career optimism that you described and the eagerness for action that you intimated at can lead us to a leadership class that is no longer realistic and not quite as supervised, perhaps, by the body politic as they should be. To answer your question, please.
You mentioned the disconnect between the all-volunteer force and the population, particularly among the more wealthy classes, an observation with which I tend to agree. However, as a counterpoint, for democracies, often the most difficult thing about war is the ability to sustain it for a long period of time, particularly as the relationship between the people and population tends to fray, public support tends to wane. Mm-hmm. And an argument could be made that through the all-volunteer force, we may have overcome the most significant danger to a war effort in a democracy, and that we no longer need popular support, and that popular indifference may be sufficient. As a counterpoint to your observation, how would you respond to that observation?
First of all, I recognize my argument is provocative, and I expect a lot of pushback like that and enjoy it and invite it. I would say that what you just described is a war that's waged without real consent. Uninformed consent is what we have right now that lets us wage our wars. And I would argue that democracy is a mechanism by which we could have consent if we engineered how we fight differently. And I think wars, as one of the most horrible things a society can take on, should be waged with consent. So I think having a force, I agree, you are right in your analysis that by having a all-volunteer force, we're able to wage without protest or as much naysaying wars over time that we might not be able to wage otherwise. And I would argue, well, that's exactly why we need democracy. So I would say, from my seat, what you said makes me redouble my argument. The risk is that reactionary populations can make it hard to wage wars that might otherwise be just. I can't think of an example right now. I'm sure if we sat down together over a pot of coffee, we could have a great talk about it all night. But I would prefer to be in a society where across the demographics, across the professions, across the population, we were all articulate in and discussing our wars and contributing together in decisions about why and how we wage them. And we don't have that right now, and to the extent the all-volunteer force enables that, I think it's a flaw of the all-volunteer force, and that it subjects a lot of good 20-year-olds to life as amputees.
Good afternoon, sir. Major Ryan Leach. So I wonder if you aren't too kind to our senior officers, and I understand some of them are your contemporaries and there's personal relationships there. But it almost seems that you've described them as actors without agency and victims in a sort, and that they've been thrust into a situation where they don't really have any agency. And I just kind of reject that. And I wonder, even if you draw parallels, you know, H.R. McMaster makes his name by seeing a similar behavior and calling it dereliction of duty. I guess how would you respond to that? Are they
I know how I'd respond to it. I think your criticism of me is fair. I'm burdened by empathy because I was a contemporary of some of these people, and I had to examine, we talked about this a little at lunch, my own thinking as I watched the wars evolve, and ask myself if I had remained in and succeeded and managed to command these similar formations, which by age and seniority I would have been eligible for, to what the colonel commanded, what I would have done differently, how I could have done it differently, what effect I might have brought that was different than the effects that these officers were bringing. And I had to be disappointed in my own answer, that I wasn't sure I could have done it differently. That I didn't have, like, if we just push this button, it gets better. Or if I can just teach these lessons, learn, it'll get better. I never found that thing. There was no sword that I could see that could be yanked from the stone to change it. And I asked myself what I might do differently. You know, I would have had one option: resign. Right? Resign. And is it in the nature of someone who has been groomed for battalion command to even be able to resign when confounded by tactics? I don't know if that guy exists. I mean, you know, you're trained to succeed and to think and to apply yourself to the puzzle. So, yeah, I had a certain amount of empathy mixed with my disgust and my confusion. And I haven't solved that. I have to own that. And so your criticism of me is fair. I accept it.
Here, González Núñez. I'm the Spanish Army liaison officer here at West Point and working in EMI. So my perspective is going to be from a foreigner who's been just a year in the States. I hope not to be very far away in my background. So I see the point. I'm going to go again through the idea of the disconnection between the armed forces and the civilian population. That happens in Europe, but especially in Spain. But I've seen that is going the opposite in Spain. I know the baseline, and all across Europe actually. I know the baseline it is very different, but in Europe and Spain, what I can talk more, we're going from Norway getting back the conscript service to Spain, where we removed it about 15, 20 years ago, and now it's some kind of civilian movement in trying to bring it back. So somehow we could say that without the conscript service or the old volunteer service, we are getting the civilian population or the population interested in defense topics. One of the, will it be because probably in Europe we feel more the threat, because we have the Russians close to there, we feel them close, even in Spain, and we are somehow not, and that's something I surprised me when I came here, that the TV and all the information pieces of news that are spread over the media in the States, they are more US focused than
Very much so.
what's going ahead. So China going into South America, into Africa, Russians spreading all over the world as well, while in here normally all the pieces of news are focusing on what's going on with the States and where the US has forces. Could it be something like that? Do you foresee any change in that?
So it's an interesting question, and now I'm going to use, and I'll paraphrase, but I can't quote exactly, a line that I read in the past week somewhere, and if any of you know who said it or wrote it, shout it out, because I thought it had a certain value to what you're talking about. First of all, I will endorse and boldface exactly what you said. Our media is very American-centric to our detriment. It's the perils of an island nation. We do not cover the world enough collectively as an industry. My employer covers the world a lot, but we could cover it more for my taste. And many other media organizations have lost the budget or the will or the combination of the two. Perhaps through their marketing analysis of what Americans read, because foreign stories don't get often as many clicks as others. Somehow we've come at a point where it seems that over the course of my life we've had a diminished discussion about our allies and our enemies abroad, and much of the discussion, unfortunately, is cartoonish. So I agree with you. So now I'm going to use try to paraphrase something I read within roughly the past week that said one of the great misfortunes of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was that we had many of our best people playing kids soccer against jihadis, while the Russians and the Chinese went about reordering their positions in the world. I don't wish to denigrate those who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq to that extent. But I do think there's a gem in that idea that what these wars have cost us has to include the realization that we've lost our focus on many other threats, and that we're facing foes and tactics that are being worked against not just us, but things we believe in to great effect. And it doesn't feel like that's enough a part of our discussion. It has started to enter the discussion more in the Trump presidency because of the notion that's held by many Americans that the election was swung and that Trump is president because of foreign interference. There's an ongoing debate about that. I'm not here to take a position, but I can say that one thing it has created is awareness of tools besides Kalashnikovs that can change our lives. So I agree with you, basically. And I would argue, again, the point of having a strategy, we were talking about it more narrowly for the global war on terror, but the strategy for the global war on terror has to rank the global war on terror against all the assembled threats that we perceive, and all the assembled, or all the potential actions that we might take against those threats. So I think it all goes back to the whole strategic review, or the strategic foundation that it feels, as someone who thinks about this a lot, that I don't feel is part and parcel of our foreign policy right now. Did I answer it? Who's next? Are we done? Oh, I'm sorry.
As he's getting the mic, I'll ask a question. We've kind of talked policy level, but we haven't explicitly talked about the role of the interagency, something DSS studies, for example, but where do you see responsibility, maybe culpability, maybe doing more as it comes to the interagency?
So I have to be careful about answering that too specifically, because I spent most of my years, as I like to say, covering sergeants and people near sergeants, warrant officers and lance corporals and captains and the like. And so I don't have and have not had as much visibility on that process. And I would be pretty far outside of my experience to try to talk about how to like tune that carburetor to make the mixture right. I think it does go back to what I said about this disengagement of the body politic. So the body politic includes all the agencies and the Congress and the executive branch and us as a nation, as a political nation guided by supposedly popular politics or representative politics. Then I would say that the agencies certainly would need to be part of that review. And right now, because the review it exists at a fairly incoherent level, that it's not where we should have it. But I know that's an insufficient answer. You should probably answer your own question, because I'm sure you probably have studied it much more than me, and you lived it because you were dealing with, in your JSOC role, I'm sure you were dealing in all sorts of interagency puzzles every hour of every day.
Next question.
Sir, Cadet Zorman, Defense and Strategic Studies major. Sir,
What studies? I didn't hear you.
Defense and Strategic Studies major, sir.
Defense and strategic studies.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I'm gonna hit my hearing aids and go to 5. So.
Sir, you mentioned how an all-volunteer force changed the dynamic of the Army. And in my opinion, that leads to groupthink. And right now, an all-volunteer force, it draws a certain kind of person. How do you think a draft would change the groupthink and the dynamic of the Army and the officer corps as a whole?
So let's work through a couple terms for my answer, because I got to define some terms by what I mean. And I got to give that caveat again. There's not going to be a draft. So this is a thought exercise, all right? There's just not going to be a draft. So let me define my terms. By all volunteer force, I'm not here to say we should have a draft, as some people would say, to stiffen the spines of American youth and all of that. I'm not an anti-millennial. I don't buy that. I watch millennials fight these wars. I have great appreciation and rich respect for young Americans. So I'm not going to play generational politics and ever suggest that everybody needs to be drafted to get their shit together. That's a ideological talking point that I scoff at. My notion for this thought exercise also includes the idea that you don't need to draft the entire force, because there will always be people like you who volunteer. You're turning up whether we have a draft or not, right? You guys didn't need to be drafted, and many of the soldiers you will lead didn't need to be drafted. They were itching to come in for a whole host of reasons. And that section of the population will always be there and will fill a significant fraction of the military. So my idea would be, again, in this thought exercise, that whatever the end strength of the military is, you draft the difference between the people who self-volunteer and what you need to fill that number, not you draft everyone who's 18 or 20. So if we have if we have 2 million people in the military, and keep it simple, 1 million people volunteer, then you're drafting to fill out the ranks of what's left. That would no doubt diversify the force intellectually. What it would look like, I don't know exactly. I mean, we can go back and look at the people who served in World War II and survived and came home, and we have an incredibly rich cross-section of politicians and professors and captains of industry and public intellectuals and novelists and some poets who were created out of that, who might not otherwise have been if we just drafted people or if we just, accepted people by recruiting them and calling them volunteers. I think it would enrich the room to have a wider cross-section of people in it. I think that's, I mean, I believe in diversity broadly and specifically, and a draft is a form of diversification. Having said that, I found that my time in the Marine Corps that was the most diverse organization I ever served in terms of geographically, racially, and ethnically, not in terms of gender, because I was in the infantry and I don't remember seeing a woman for years doing my duties. It was an utterly segregated and persistently misogynistic organization. But across the other lines of diversity, a draft could change some of that, and it might change the nature of the behaviors and the conversations of your cohort. But I can't tell you exactly what it would look like, and I have to go back to where I started. It's not going to happen. This is meant as a provocation, not as a policy proposal that's ever going to come to bear. Who should I pick? Part of the diversity, we're going to go to the necktie.
We're holding a conference in a few months on the kind of the nuclear warfare. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what technologies, based on your research for the gun, you think are important, and which ones you think are just going to be, you know, we're going to be thinking about AI and, you know, kind of big data and autonomous systems. Which ones are the ones that you think in 30, you know, several generations from now will be saying?
So the question's about the future of warfare, and I have a lot of stock lines I fall back, and this is my Terminator screen. And so one of the lines I say all the time, and I'll read it off now, is that things are hard to predict, especially the future. I don't know what the future looks like. I have trouble describing what happened yesterday. I mean, it takes all my power to make a reasonable facsimile, assuming everyone's being honest with me and I have access to rich materials. I still have trouble telling you what happened yesterday. I'm going to have a lot of trouble. I don't believe in much future prediction beyond about the 1-week weather forecast. And I certainly don't try to create those because I'm not able to. But I can talk along the lines of change we've seen over the last 15, 16, 17 years of these wars that were principally under discussion here today. The future includes an enemy that we have now, minimally, and we have made an enemy we can't defeat. That enemy is our creation. And by we, I mean the conventional militaries of this world, going back a couple of generations now with the mass distribution of these weapons, the small arms. Every place now where a conventional army turns up can be very quickly armed around the conventional army by black markets in a matter of months or a couple of years. That's one. And that's a longer trend line that goes back to the development and mass production of light infantry automatic weapons. But the other thing that we've developed since 2001 is a generation, a cohort, a culture of IED makers that have gotten better and better and better. And wherever you guys turn up on long-term duty, on hostile turf, that's turning up too. That culture is transferable. That culture is connected to the global economy. That culture is no longer soldering together circuits in apartments in Baghdad. It's buying them on bulk from China and distributing them out to the field. We have created an enemy that I don't think we can fight frontally and beat. We have to accept the existence of this enemy and adapt to it. And some of that's our own fault. You know, long-term occupation does one thing we know for sure, always. It creates a capable insurgent. Long-term occupation, as someone said to me more than a decade ago, when the occupation was still reasonably short-term, kills the junior varsity pretty quickly. And the people who are left to fight against the occupying forces get better over time. And you can mow the lawn and clean them up, but they recur because the tactics and the weapons they need are so profligate now, so widely and quickly shared. So the future, to answer your question, I think should include a strategic realization that we need to be very, very careful about where we fix forces on the ground. because those forces are going to pay.
All right, I think we're about done. I do want to, again, I think it was obvious to the audience here that your passion, as you say, for the lance corporal, the sergeant, the lieutenant and captain, the human cost of the service in these long wars is captured very well in here. And from a discussion with a mom of a severely wounded Navy corpsman with former President Bush, to discussions that the F-14, then F-18 pilot had as he reconciled, do I get off the fast ship, literally, do I take myself out of command of an aircraft carrier to spend time with my family, after he spent a career wondering if he killed a family with an errant strike in Kosovo. And again, the human and emotional toll of the service. I think everybody that serves in DMI has served multiple tours overseas and will relate to this, but younger, next generation of officers that may not experience the same may want to put your nose in here a little bit. So you develop a little empathy, not to say you wouldn't have, but a little empathy for the service members that you're going to lead. Some of them will bring back trials and tribulations. It'll be easy as a new lieutenant, new platoon leader, to say, you know, Sergeant X, he just messed that up and we need to hammer him. You might need to peel the onion back, like I encourage my junior leaders to. How culpable are we as a force in a country in that particular officer's issues that they have? And for the, again, for the cadets in here, I'll tell you, I ask that question about my own department when I have officers kind of come up on my radar scope. And it's happened since I've been here over the last year. How culpable are we as an Army in a country in the problems that our younger soldiers, vets of this global war on terror, or officers, how culpable are we in the problems that we're having? So before you rush to judgment, and that's not to give everybody that's ever served overseas a pass, but it is to have a little bit of empathy and ask the question. So Chris, I appreciate you taking the time. I really appreciate you writing this. It's pretty special. And it's not about my unit, it's about like soldiers and service members that I've served with, and I really appreciate the work. I think you told me it took 6 or 8 years to write it, and that passion comes out in the book. So thank you for all you've done. Thanks.